Hello and welcome. Thank you very much for joining me for another presentation as part of the GreyLearning webinar series. Very happy to be here today and actually talking about one of my favorite subjects. For a long time, I've been a big fan of, I guess Adobe Photoshop in general, but targeted adjustments in particular. And so today I'm going to share some of my top tips, basically kind of give you an overview of what I think are the key things you need to keep in mind or be aware of when it comes to applying targeted adjustments in Photoshop. So we'll dive into that momentarily. First, though, I do want to give a shout out to Tamron, thanking them once again for making the GreyLearning webinar series possible, today's presentation, and in fact all of this year's presentations as part of the GreyLearning webinar series have been sponsored by Tamron USA. And I know I've mentioned it more than once, but if you get a chance, if you haven't already, take a look at the video featuring yours truly, featuring me out in the remarkable Palouse, photographing a wide variety of subjects. If you go to Tamron's YouTube page, which is youtube.com/TamronVids, then you can search for the One Location, One Lesson, One Lens series and find my episode included among a bunch of other great videos as well. And who am I? Well, I'm Tim Gray. I know many of you already knew that and have been following me to some extent, perhaps getting the daily Ask Tim Gray email newsletter. I continue to be shocked on some level that so many photographers are happy to have an extra email in their inbox each weekday morning. So thank you for those of you who get that daily email. If you're not already getting it, you can go to asktimgray.com and sign yourself up for that daily email list. As many of you know already, I love traveling all over the world. I love photographing, and I'm very passionate about sharing the knowledge, the experience that I've gained over the years with you, including in today's presentation. And just to make sure I don't forget, if you want to learn more, today I'm sort of giving you, you might say, a high-level overview of targeted adjustments and specific techniques. If you want to go more in-depth, there are a couple of courses, video courses, on the GreyLearning website that focus on one course on selections and another on layer masking, specifically targeted adjustments, as well as one on composite images if you're inclined to do that. And you can get the Photoshop for Photographers bundle, which includes all of the courses that I've produced on Adobe Photoshop in one convenient bundle at one low price. And as part of today's webinar presentation, you can get that full bundle. Normally it's $99, get it for just $79 using the coupon code you see here, webinar79PS for that $79 price tag, or there's a link there that'll take you directly to the GreyLearning website and have that discount included automatically. All right, enough of all of that. Let's dive in to Photoshop and take a look at some techniques for applying targeted adjustments. And I suppose the first order of business would be to consider what is a targeted adjustment anyway. And I suppose it's somewhat self-explanatory. It's an adjustment that is targeted. In other words, an adjustment that only affects a specific area of an image. And so just as a very basic concept, with this photo, for example, perhaps I want to add a little more drama to the sky, maybe darken it up, add some contrast. I could apply an adjustment that affects the sky without actually affecting the foreground. And the way I like to think of this is that there are essentially two ingredients to a targeted adjustment. There's the adjustment, of course, and then there's the targeted, or in the context of Photoshop, what that means is a layer mask. And a layer mask, I think, is one of those abstract concepts that a lot of photographers sort of struggle with. They don't seem to really grasp. It seems so theoretical. Really, it's very simple, I think. If you consider that a layer mask is really just a stencil. And so let's go ahead and create just a really quick example here. I won't worry about making it a perfect adjustment. I'll add an adjustment layer. So down at the bottom of the Layers panel, I'm going to click the Add Adjustment Layer button. That's the half black, half white circle icon. This allows me to add an adjustment layer, which means I'm keeping my adjustment separate from the image itself. I'm not actually changing the pixel values directly. I'm essentially just adding metadata that includes details about the adjustment that I want to apply. And this gives me what is effectively a non-destructive workflow. I can always come back and make changes revise my adjustment as many times as I want to. So if you're not already using adjustment layers, first off, it's sort of necessary, or at least I think necessary, it's important anyway, when it comes to applying targeted adjustments, but it just is a good workflow practice in general. So I'm going to add, in this case, a curves adjustment. So there's a variety of different types of adjustments that I could add. I'm going to use curves just because it gives me some more flexibility in terms of the overall effect. And I'm going to apply an exaggerated adjustment here. I'll just apply a significant darkening, enhancing contrast just a little bit. And you can see, of course, that the adjustment, the first of two ingredients for my targeted adjustment, the adjustment is affecting the entire image, which in this case is not what I want. But the reason for that is I have an adjustment, but I don't have a targeted yet. I don't have that layer mask. Well, actually, I do have a layer mask. I do have a stencil, but right now the stencil is saying that the entire image should be adjusted. And that makes sense, of course. Normally, when you apply an adjustment to a photo, you probably want to affect the entire photo. In this case, though, I want to target that adjustment. So let's take a look at the layer mask. On the layers panel, you can see I have my original image, that background image layer, and I also have an adjustment layer. In this case, it happens to be a curves adjustment, so there's a thumbnail for the curves adjustment. I could click on the background image layer if I needed to go do some work there, and I could click on the thumbnail for the adjustment layer, the curves adjustment in this case, to get back to actually adjusting the settings, changing the adjustment itself. In addition, though, to the thumbnail for the adjustment layer on the layers panel, there is this white rectangle over to the right of the adjustment layer thumbnail. This is my layer mask, or I guess I should say it's a representation of my layer mask. It shows me that there is a layer mask there, and it gives me a thumbnail representation of what it looks like. In the context of a targeted adjustment, the key thing to keep in mind is that black blocks and white reveals. Meaning, if there are areas of this layer mask that are black, those areas will not be affected by the adjustment. Areas of that thumbnail that are white mean that those areas of the image will be adjusted, will be affected by my adjustment layer. Since, as you can see in the thumbnail, the layer mask is entirely white, the entire image is getting the adjustment. If I want to change which areas of the photo are being affected versus not being affected by my adjustment, all I need to do is change my layer mask. Paint with black to block and white to reveal, but really I just need to define a stencil. So I'm going to choose the brush tool, and I'm going to set my foreground color to black. I'll adjust my brush size as needed. Maybe I'll use a slightly less soft version of the brush. Don't worry about the particulars for the moment. This, again, is just a refresher of the concept here. But I can now paint with black in order to block the adjustment. So you can see the original image is now showing through in the foreground. Don't worry about the fact that I'm not doing a perfect job painting here. Just get an idea of the overall concept. Now I have an adjustment that is affecting the sky, but is not affecting the foreground. More or less, if you'll forgive my sloppy painting there. But now, more importantly, if you take a look at the thumbnail for the adjustment layer's mask, you can see that it now defines a stencil, a shape, a cutout, if you will, where black blocks and white reveals. And so in this case, I have a stencil where I can see the sky, but I can't see the foreground, you might say. Or where the adjustment is blocked for the foreground, but revealed for the sky. This is the fundamental concept that you need to understand when it comes to applying targeted adjustments in Photoshop. You have those two ingredients, the adjustment and the targeted, to create a targeted adjustment. So an adjustment layer and a layer mask that defines the stencil for the area of the image that we actually want to work with. And of course, there are a wide variety of ways that we can go about these various tasks, many of which, of course, I'll talk about a little more today. All right, so let's go ahead and close this image so that we can move on to some slightly more sophisticated concepts. And I want to address, first of all, the notion of not necessarily needing to use a layer mask, at least in the context of a targeted adjustment. So let's take a look at this image. I have a composite panorama. This happens to be a set of 3 photos that have been combined. Now, it just so happens that those images have been combined via layer masks. And so I'm revealing a portion of each of these images, and you can see that the exposure doesn't match up. So I have a darker image over on the left side here, a dark image over on the right side, and a brighter image in the middle. Conceptually, I need a targeted adjustment. I need to have an adjustment that will affect this brighter area in the middle. And that would be a perfectly reasonable approach here, but it's not necessary, because I can also focus an adjustment on just a single image layer. So at the moment, you can see on the layers panel that I have 3 image layers, the left, the middle, and the right in terms of the panorama itself, and I only need to affect the middle layer. Well, one of the things to keep in mind about adjustment layers is that they only affect layers that are below them. So let's go ahead and just add another curves adjustment. In fact, I'm going to start off at the very top of my layer stack. Now, when you add a layer, by default, it's going to be placed above the currently active layer. So right now, I've clicked on the thumbnail for the topmost layer on the layers panel, and so when I add a new adjustment layer, it's going to go above that layer. It'll be at the top of the stack. So I'll go ahead and add a curves adjustment layer, for example, and if I get down to my properties panel here, I'll just go ahead and darken the overall image. I'm using a curves adjustment that will darken the image, just dragging the curve down in this case. Now, obviously, that's not a good adjustment here, but it helps to illustrate that at the moment, my curves adjustment layer is affecting all 3 of the image layers in this composite panorama. If I don't want to affect all of the images, all of the layers here, I can simply move that curves adjustment layer to a different position. So I can click on the thumbnail and drag it downward, for example. You'll notice that as I'm dragging, I get a little blue line indicating where I will be dropping this layer when I release the mouse button. So I'll drop my curves layer so that it is above the bottommost image layer. And you can see that now I have a dark layer over on the left, or I guess you could say a normal layer, more or less, a bright layer in the middle, and a rather dark, a very dark layer over on the right-hand side. And I think that makes it reasonably clear at this point that only this rightmost image layer is being affected by my curves adjustment. If I drag upward a layer above, now I'm not affecting the leftmost layer, I am darkening the middle layer, and I'm also darkening the right layer. They weren't even in terms of exposure to begin with, so we don't have a matching effect. But you can see that I'm adjusting both the middle and the far right layers. If I want the adjustment to only affect a single layer, then I want to put that adjustment into a clipping group with the layer below. And there are a couple of ways that you can go about that. Basically, I want to say this curves adjustment should only affect the image layer directly below it. I can do that by first selecting the adjustment layer and then clicking the button at the bottom of the properties panel, the leftmost button here, which will put that adjustment layer into a clipping group with the layer below. You can also see that the curves adjustment layer is indented and there's this little arrow to indicate that it is applying to only the layer down below. You can also hold the Alt key on Windows or the Option key on Macintosh while clicking on the little dividing line in between the adjustment layer and the layer directly below. And so now, because my adjustment layer is in a clipping group with the layer below, I am no longer affecting the bottom layer. I'm only affecting the, in this case, middle layer. And so now if I go back to my curves adjustment, I can go ahead and refine that adjustment and hopefully find just the right adjustment so that the middle layer will then match up with the adjoining layers. But again, the key is that in this case, I've now put my adjustment layer into a clipping group so that it only affects a single layer in my composite, so I didn't even have to worry about the layer mask for that particular adjustment layer. So just keep in mind that we don't necessarily always need a layer mask in order to define a targeted adjustment, depending on the nature of what we're doing. All right, moving right along, and we will take a look at another image here. We have addressed that concept of a layer mask being a stencil, where black blocks and white reveals. But I think it's also important to keep in mind that we can use other colors as well. We can use shades of gray. And so if, for example, I were to apply another adjustment, let's assume that I want to lighten up this image a little bit. I want to open up some of the detail in the tree, but that's perhaps too much for some of these other areas of the image. And so on the layer mask for my curves adjustment layer, I might, for example, I'll go ahead and soften this up a little bit, but I could then paint with black in order to block the adjustment in some areas of the photo. But then I might decide that actually I do want to partially brighten up an area of the image. So if you look at the thumbnail for my layer mask, you can see that there is black and white. I've blocked some areas and I've revealed some areas in terms of this adjustment. So the adjustment is more or less affecting the trees at the bottom right, but it is not affecting the glacier here, nor is it affecting the rocks in the background. But I can also vary that effect. So instead of just using black, which blocks completely, or white, which reveals completely, I can paint with a shade of gray. I could use a reduced opacity, but generally I find that that's a little bit tricky, and so instead I prefer to choose a different shade of gray. So down at the bottom of the toolbox, I'm going to click the color swatch for the foreground color. It's currently black. That will bring up the color picker, and then I'm going to set the brightness value. So in the HSB model, hue, saturation, and brightness, brightness means how close to black versus white is this color, or in this case is the shade of gray. Well, black blocks the adjustment, and black has a brightness value of 0, so that's 0% of the adjustment. White has a brightness value of 100%, and that represents 100% of the adjustment. So I can dial in a brightness value based on how much of the adjustment I actually want. So let's say, for example, I want it at half strength. I could dial in a 50% brightness. In other words, a shade of gray that has a 50% brightness value. So I'll set that as my foreground color. I'll click OK. And now, using a smaller brush size here, I can paint into, for example, the rocky area here. And because I have painted with middle gray, this area is getting half the effect. So my stencil, my layer mask, now defines that the tree area is white, so it gets the full effect of the adjustment. The glacier area is black on the layer mask, so it gets none of the adjustment. And the rocky area at the top left is middle gray, so it gets half of the adjustment. So now, as I refine the overall adjustment, you can probably tell that I'm getting a stronger effect over the trees than I'm getting for the rocks, and I'm getting none of the adjustment in the glacier. So keep in mind that we can have these partial effects. I can have some areas of the image get a stronger effect from my adjustment, my targeted adjustment, compared to other areas of the photo. All right, moving right along. I think it's critical, perhaps, to keep in mind that very often it is easiest to create a targeted adjustment based on a selection. In this case, for example, perhaps I wanted to apply an adjustment to only the statue or only the sky, rather than trying to paint around every little nook and cranny of the shape of this statue. I might want to simply create a selection. Let's try our luck with the new Object Selection tool, for example. So I'll choose the Object Selection tool from the toolbox, set the mode to Rectangle, and then draw a basic rectangle around the statue here. Release the mouse. Photoshop will then analyze that area of the image and attempt to create a selection of that portion of the image. And actually, in this case, it looks like it has done a rather good job. It's just missing this little area down below. So I'll hold the Alt or Option key. Well, I should say it's including that area down below of the sky that should not be included. And so with the Object Subtract option set to yes, in other words, that checkbox turned on, I'm still using a rectangle, which is fine. I can then hold the Alt key on Windows or the Option key on Macintosh, draw a little box. Well, it didn't do very good there. Let's switch to the lasso tool, once again holding Alt or Option. Draw a lasso around. Didn't do a very good job there. And so we learn another valuable lesson, and that is that in some cases it is much better to mix and match various tools rather than trying to use a single tool to accomplish all of your goals. So in the context of selections, sometimes it's better to mix and match rather than to try to use a single tool for all of the creation of that selection. So I'm going to use the quick selection tool here, hold the Alt or Option key, paint into the area that I want to subtract, and now I have a good selection. At the moment, that selection is of the statue. And so it's worth keeping in mind that sometimes it's easier to select the opposite of what you want, or sometimes you didn't even think about it. I just created a selection of the statue without necessarily realizing, oh, actually I want to affect the sky, not the statue. Well, I can always invert that selection. So right now, I'll zoom out a little bit. You can tell that the marching ants display, the animated dashed line here that indicates the outer boundary of my selection, it surrounds the statue. If I invert the selections, I'll go to the Select menu and choose Inverse, or there's a keyboard shortcut, of course. I could press Control-Shift-I on Windows or Command-Shift-I on Macintosh. That will invert the selection, and now you'll see that there is that animated line that actually goes around the outer edge of the image, which is my clue that the selection is of the sky, not of the statue. You'll recall that when I added a new adjustment layer, which I then painted on the layer mask in order to make that adjustment targeted, that the layer mask came with the adjustment layer automatically. I added a curves adjustment layer, and that curves adjustment layer included that white thumbnail for the layer mask without me having to do anything. It was just automatically there. When I have a selection active, the layer mask associated with the new adjustment layer that I add will automatically reflect the selection. So when it comes to using a selection as the basis of a targeted adjustment, the process is incredibly easy. Make a selection of the area you want to adjust, and then add an adjustment layer, and that adjustment layer will automatically apply to only the areas that you had selected. Of course, sometimes creating the selection in the first place isn't exactly easy. It may be very complicated, requiring lots of work, but the point is that once you have a selection, creating a targeted adjustment based on that selection is as easy as adding an adjustment layer. So I have a selection active, in this case of the sky. I go to the Layers panel, click the button to add a new adjustment layer, choose the type of adjustment I want to add, and now you can see the thumbnail on the Layers panel for my adjustment layer. The layer mask thumbnail reflects that stencil. The sky is being adjusted, and the statue is not. And as I as I swing wildly with my curves adjustment, you can see that I am indeed affecting the sky without affecting the statue. So a very simple process of creating a selection, adding an adjustment layer, and you're in business. You've got yourself a targeted adjustment. It really can be that simple sometimes. Now, when it comes to selections, one of the key issues that I find a lot of photographers sort of struggle with is the notion of feathering the selection. No pun intended with our cute little burrowing owl here loaded with feathers. When it comes to selections, there is a concept of feathering. And in theory, I absolutely want to feather every single selection I create. In reality, I never feather selections. Because if you feather a selection, you need to know by how much you should feather. So here I'm already set to the quick selection tool. Let's see if we can create a quick selection of the background here. That worked reasonably well. I could then subtract some areas that were included. The bird here, the owl, got selected just a little bit in a few areas, and so I could clean that up by subtracting those areas from the selection. I won't worry in this case about getting it absolutely perfect. You get the idea here that I'm creating a selection of the background. Well, if I'm going to apply a relatively strong adjustment to the background, maybe I want to darken it up a bit, for example, then I want to have a smooth transition. So let's show you the problem here first. I'll go ahead and add a curves adjustment, for example, and as I apply a darkening effect, if we zoom in on the owl here, you'll see that there's absolutely no transition. We go from an area that's being adjusted, that's being affected by my targeted adjustment, to an area that is not being affected, so the background versus the owl, and there's virtually no transition there at all. And we want a transition. So if we take a step backward, a couple steps backward to get back to our selection, I could modify the selection by feathering it, by softening up that edge, getting a little bit of a transition there. So if I go to the Select menu and choose Modify, followed by Feather, I can choose a radius setting. How many pixels shall I feather by? Maybe 5, or 10, or 20? It depends. It depends on the extent to which you need to feather, essentially. And that varies based on how strong your adjustment is, as well as the relative size or the edge transition distance for the object. Is it, a rock statue that has a very crisp edge, or is it a fuzzy little owl or something else that, furry and feathery or whatever the case might be, where it's fuzzy? And so we have to guess at how much feathering to use, and if it's wrong, then we have to undo and try again with different settings. Instead, I never feather selections, and instead I save that feathering for the layer mask. Because the layer mask really is essentially just a selection in a different form. And just as we could feather a selection to soften up the edge, so too can we essentially feather a layer mask after the fact. So I'm going to click Cancel here to not feather that selection, and I'll go ahead and add that curves adjustment layer once again, and I'll make this exaggerated so it's easier to see what's going on. We can zoom in and get once again a look at that lack of transition. But then on the Properties panel, right now I'm working with my curves adjustment, the adjustment itself. The icon to the right of that, underneath the Properties tab, is the Layer Mask icon, and there we can adjust the layer mask itself. And one of the very basic attributes of that layer mask is the feathering. Just like there's the feathering for selections, so too can we feather the layer mask after the fact. The advantage to saving this step for after I've applied an adjustment is that now I can see on the image itself just how much feathering I actually need. I can see the real effect, the final effect, rather than having to sort of guess and use trial and error. And so I'll go ahead and increase the value for feather, and you'll see that I'm gradually softening up that transition and blending and blending and blending. And if we zoom out, you'll see that at this point, I've gotten that blending to be too much. So keep in mind that while a crisp edge to our selection, essentially, or our layer mask, is not a good thing in most situations, it's also problematic if that feathering is too much. And so we want to find just the right amount, and the best way, as far as I'm concerned, to find the right amount is to base your evaluation on the actual final effect, based on the adjustment you're applying in conjunction with the layer mask that you're refining, that you're feathering. And in this case, of course, the adjustment is quite exaggerated. If I reduce that effect, maybe just darken up a little bit, now it's actually less critical that my feathering is perfect, but I'd rather have it as close to perfect as possible so that there's never any strong indication that anything was done to this image. I suppose on some level, I want everybody to believe that it came out of the camera exactly the way it looks and that Photoshop was never necessary in the first place. All right, so moving right along, I'll close this image and we can take a look at another key concept which I've addressed to some extent here in the context of a selection. But as I mentioned, oftentimes it's easier to create a selection of the area you don't actually want to select. So here, let's assume I want to apply an adjustment that only affects the rocks. The rocky area of the scene here is not quite as uniform as the sky. So it would actually be easier to create a selection of the sky than it would to create a selection of the rocks. And so I'll use the quick selection tool once again, which by the way, is usually my go-to tool. It's usually the first tool that I will try when it comes to creating a selection, because more often than not, it gives me a very good selection, which at least provides a good starting point for my adjustment, for my targeted adjustment. I can always refine later. So I have this selection, which appears to be just about perfect. So as we already know, I can create a selection, then add an adjustment layer, and that adjustment layer will automatically reflect the shape of my selection. Except now, oops, I realize that I made the selection backwards, you might say. I wanted to adjust the rocky area. Instead, I'm adjusting the sky because it was easier to select the sky, and I forgot to invert my selection. Well, I think one of the things that it's important to keep in mind when it comes to a layer mask is that a layer mask is essentially just an image being used in a different form. In this case, it is an image where the rocky area is black and the sky is white. You might think of it as something of a silhouette of this rocky outcropping. So it's just a shape. It's just an image. It's in some ways just a photo, sort of. Not really a photograph, but in any event, it's an image, and I can use all of the available tools in Photoshop to modify that image, that layer mask. You've already seen me, for example, paint with black and white and middle gray in order to modify the layer mask. But there's all sorts of other tools that are available inside of Photoshop for working with images, and those tools, those various adjustments, for example, can also be used with a layer mask. And so in this case, I've clicked on the thumbnail for my layer mask to make sure it is active, and now I want to do something to it. Specifically, I want to invert it. I want to flip it so that the rocks in the foreground are white rather than black, and the sky is black rather than white, so that the adjustment affects the rocks instead of the sky. I'm reversing my stencil, essentially. Well, that's an invert. I want the inverse of the current layer mask, so I select the layer mask, and there are several ways that I could go about doing this. First of all, once I've clicked on the layer mask, on the Properties panel, I'm now in that layer mask mode, and you might notice there is a button down here at the bottom right called Invert. So I could click that button and invert my layer mask. In addition, though, just to kind of help reinforce that notion that a layer mask is just an image in a different form, and that we can use all of the various tools in Photoshop to modify it, if I go to the Image menu, under Adjustments, you'll find that I have an Invert command. So I could invert that layer mask. I could also press Control-I on Windows or Command-I on Macintosh in order to invert my mask. And then, of course, once I have the mask corrected, I could change the actual adjustment. Maybe I just want to darken a little bit for the foreground or add a little bit of contrast or whatever the case might be. The point is to keep in mind that that layer mask is essentially an image, and when it's the opposite of what you actually want, you can always invert that mask. And I suppose actually it's a good point, a little bonus tip, good point to mention that we can also reselect based on a layer mask. So in this case, for example, let's say I've created an adjustment for the rocks based on that layer mask, that stencil, and I want to reload that layer mask as a selection so that I could then invert it and create an adjustment for the sky. If you hold the Control key on Windows or the Command key on Macintosh, you can then click, while you're holding that Control or Command key, click on the thumbnail for the layer mask on the Layers panel, and that will load the layer mask as a selection. I could then invert the selection, for example, and add an additional adjustment so that I could have an adjustment for only the sky, just as I have another adjustment for only the rocks. So we can load a layer mask as a selection and then, of course, manipulate that selection, use the selection as the basis of another adjustment layer as a layer mask for that adjustment layer, and then, of course, continue to refine the layer mask itself directly. Okay, I hope you're having as much fun as I am. I do now want to address a question actually that was submitted in advance by one of my readers in terms of using smart objects. When would you use a smart object in conjunction with a layer mask? And I guess the short answer is almost never. And what I mean by that is essentially I just don't use smart objects all that much because as cool as they do introduce some challenges in your workflow. So for example, one of the reasons you might want to use a smart object is to apply filters in a non-destructive way. So I have a background image layer here. I can go to the filter menu and choose to convert it for smart filters, which really means make the background image layer a smart object. And so I'll go ahead and choose that option. And now my background image layer is a smart object. So now when I apply a filter, so let's say, for example, just for simplicity's sake, let's assume that I want to apply a blur that is only going to affect the background, at least eventually. Then I can apply that blur. So let's say I'm going for a narrow depth of field effect, whatever the case might be. I click OK. I've applied a blur, but I haven't actually altered the original underlying pixels. Instead, I've applied that blur as a smart filter, and the smart filter comes with its own layer mask. So I could, for example, paint with black. So I'll just use a real quick selection here. Well, painting, not a selection, but painting on the layer mask, just a quick, rough, dirty job so that you can get a sense of that, where I'm painting onto that layer mask. The problem is that now the smart object creates some other challenges in my workflow. So if, for example, I realize that I need to perform some image cleanup work, that's actually not going to be easy to accomplish in the context of a smart object because I can't work directly on that smart object. I'd have to double-click, go back to the original. The workflow starts to get a little bit cumbersome. And so as a general rule, I simply prefer not to use smart objects because as cool as they are, it makes for a great demo when I show you how amazing smart objects can be, but then you start running into some workflow limitations, and I find that that's especially true when it comes to needing to perform some image cleanup work. All right, and then I think one of the key things from a workflow, I guess you could call this a workflow efficiency standpoint, one of the key things that I try to reinforce is to keep things as simple as possible. I'm sure many of you, most of you have probably already tried or, to some extent are applying targeted adjustments in your images, and you've run into some challenges. You find it to be a little bit, difficult creating a good selection, getting the layer mask perfectly aligned with, the area that you want to adjust. As much as you can keep things simple and streamlined, the better. So in the context of a targeted adjustment, one of the things that I find is very often true is that if you want to apply a targeted adjustment, you probably want to apply more than one adjustment to the same area. So let's take a look at a couple variations on a theme here. First off, I'm going to create a selection. So as is very often the case, I want to use a selection as the basis of my targeted adjustment. And since we're all friends here, we'll just assume, without even zooming in, we'll assume that that selection is absolutely perfect. Obviously, normally I would want to try to make sure that the selection is as accurate as possible right from the start. We'll assume it's perfect for our purposes here today. So I have a selection active, and as we've already discussed, I could simply add an adjustment layer to create a targeted adjustment. So if I add a curves adjustment, that adjustment layer will automatically reflect my selection, so the sky in this case, so that my adjustment only affects the sky. But later I might realize, for example, if I zoom in, that I missed some areas of sky here, a little gap in between the bell tower and the cliff and within the windows of the bell tower. And so I might want to make some changes to this layer mask later. I also probably need to feather it. Almost always will I need to feather my layer mask after the fact. But of course, the problem is if I now add another adjustment, I can hold the Control key on Windows or the Command key on Macintosh and click on the thumbnail for my layer mask, and that creates a selection based on the layer mask. Now I could add, let's say a hue saturation adjustment, and I'll just make a wild adjustment here just to make it obvious and to have a little fun. I'm applying multiple adjustments to the same area. But now when I finally get around to cleaning up the layer mask in this little portion of the image, I need to go fix it in 2 places, or more, depending on how many adjustment layers I've actually added. And so it's a lot more efficient to use one layer mask with multiple adjustments. And the way we can do that is with a layer group. So in a moment here, I'll take a step backwards and restart this process the way I would normally want to start it. But of course, you may have an image where you didn't start that way. So let's take a look at how to fix this, essentially. First off, I'm going to create a layer group. That's the folder icon down at the bottom of the Layers panel. So I'll click that little folder icon, and you can see that I have a layer group, a little folder added on my Layers panel. I like to try to stay organized, so I like to rename these layer groups. I'll double click on the name of the layer group, and I'll call this Sky Adjustment, for example. And then I want to make sure that this layer group is actually affecting these adjustment layers, and so I need to put my adjustment layers inside the layer group. And what that means is I drag and drop. So I can drag the thumbnail for my adjustment layer and drop it right onto my layer group, onto that folder. Notice that the adjustment layer, once it's inside, gets indented. I'll do the same with the other adjustment, and now both of my adjustment layers are inside my layer group. Of course, I've not really accomplished anything at this point with that layer group other than organizing my layers panel. So if I collapse that Sky Adjustment layer group, you can see that things are a bit more tidy because of that group, but the group's not really giving me a significant benefit in terms of the targeted adjustment. But what I can do is have a single layer mask that affects all of these adjustments. So I'm going to hold the Control key on Windows or the Command key on Macintosh while clicking on the thumbnail for the layer mask for one of my adjustments. And then I'm going to click on the layer group, in this case the Sky Adjustment layer group, so that that is active. And I'm going to add a layer mask to this layer group. So our adjustment layers came with a layer mask automatically, but I can also add a layer mask to a layer group. So the layer group's active, I have a selection active out in the image, and then I can click the Add Layer Mask button, this circle inside of a square icon at the bottom of the Layers panel, and that adds a layer mask to my layer group. So now everything inside this layer group is only visible based on the layer mask, based on the stencil here, the sky. Of course, we already knew the adjustments were only affecting the sky because each of those adjustments has its own layer mask. But I could, for example, fill the layer mask with white or just get rid of the layer mask altogether. So I'll just drag the layer mask for my curves adjustment down to the trash can. I'll click delete to confirm. I'll do the same with the other layer mask. And now both of these adjustments have no layer mask, and yet both of those adjustments are still targeted because both of those adjustments are constrained by the layer mask that is associated with the layer group. And so if I make that layers panel a little bit larger, you can see that there is a layer mask attached to my layer group, and there are adjustment layers inside of the layer group, and therefore the adjustments inside the layer group are only visible based on the layer mask that's associated with the layer group. We can even take that concept a step further. So just to illustrate things a little bit more here, we could create a selection. Let's say we want to adjust the sky, for example. So let's see if our quick selection tool will once again save the day here as far as the creation of a selection. That looks pretty good. So let's assume that I've got a perfect selection of the sky. I promised that I would mention the workflow that I would normally use if I thought about the concept of a layer group right up front. In other words, wanting to apply multiple adjustments to the same area of an image. So multiple adjustments for the sky here. Instead of just adding an adjustment layer, at this point, I'm about to start applying a targeted adjustment. I'm going to create a layer group rather than an adjustment layer. So basically the same thing. I'll end up with the same result we had just a few moments ago. I'll just be doing it sort of in the right order, you might say. So I'll add a layer group and then add a layer mask to that layer group. So now I have a layer group with a layer mask that reflects the sky. It's a stencil for the sky. I can now add adjustments. So let's go ahead and, well, we'll add a curves adjustment since that seems to be the theme of the day here as far as the types of adjustments I'm applying. And so there's my curves adjustment. I could also add, well, let's say a vibrance adjustment because I want to kick up that saturation a little bit. And I could apply a variety of other adjustments. Maybe I want, for example, a color balance adjustment to shift those colors just a little bit. So maybe something like that. So now I have, in this case, 3 adjustments that are all affecting only the sky, because all 3 of these adjustments are inside the layer group. So with the previous image, I had to move my adjustment layers into the layer group by dragging and dropping. But if a layer group is active, or if one of the adjustment layers that's already inside a layer group is active, when I add a new adjustment layer, it will automatically go inside that layer group. So let's go ahead and strengthen this adjustment just a little bit for illustrative purposes so that we can better see what's going on. I'll just make this an exaggerated darkening of the image. And now let's consider that I might want my adjustment to taper off from the top to the bottom. So now I actually want perhaps a gradient layer mask. Well, we probably understand the basic concepts involved here, and so I'll go ahead and collapse that group. I'm going to make another group, so let's call the first group Sky, and the second group will be Gradient. And I could add a layer mask to the layer group, and then I could choose the Gradient tool from the toolbox. I'll make sure that I'm set to a gradient that is foreground color to background color. I'll press X to switch my foreground and background colors. The color picker is shown down at the bottom of the toolbox. So now my foreground to background color gradient, that first option on the pop-up, is white to black. I want it to be a linear gradient, a straight line, not a radial, for example, a reflective gradient. Blend mode normal, opacity at 100%. Those are the defaults. And now on my gradient layer mask for that gradient layer group, I'm going to simply click and drag to define a gradient. So in this case, a vertical gradient going from the top of the image to the bottom of the image, holding the Shift key, by the way, to constrain to one of the key 45-degree angles so that I can get a perfectly vertical gradient. And if you take a look at the Layers panel, you'll see that my gradient layer group has a layer mask in the form of a gradient. So revealing at the top of the image, blocking at the bottom of the image with a smooth transition in between. Well, that's the layer mask that I want to have available in order to get that gradient effect, except you can see in the image the gradient is having absolutely no impact on the image, and that's because my layer group, that gradient layer group, is empty. There's nothing inside of the layer group to be constrained by that layer mask. I could take my adjustments from the Sky layer group, drag and drop them into the Gradient layer group, but that would cause the adjustments to affect the entire image in a gradient. So let's, for example, put our Curves adjustment into that Gradient group, and you'll see that now I'm affecting the top of the rocks here in addition to the sky, and that's not what I want at all. So I do want my Curves adjustment inside the Sky layer group, but I also want it inside the Gradient layer group, and I can accomplish that by stacking, by nesting these folders. I can take the Sky layer group and drag and drop it inside the Gradient layer group. So now my adjustments are only affecting the sky, but they're also only affecting the gradient, and so now I have the best of both worlds. I'll go ahead and fine-tune this Curves adjustment, and you can see that I'm only affecting the sky, but I'm affecting the sky in a gradient fashion. So maybe I'll darken up a bit there. I could also, of course, go back to my gradient and draw a different gradient if I'd like, but the point is that I can nest multiple layer groups together, each with its own layer mask, so that I can effectively have the effect of multiple layer masks for potentially multiple adjustments. Now, of course, along the way, you may have noticed that not all of my layer masks were absolutely perfect. Thank you for noticing if you did notice, or thank you for ignoring that fact if you chose to pleasantly, politely ignore the fact that the selections, the layer masks, were not necessarily absolutely perfect. Let's see if we can get this image to open up correctly. We cannot. Well, that's curious. There it is. All right, so we now have, of course, the potential that some of our selections or some of our layer masking work might not have been absolutely perfect. I was cutting myself a little bit of slack because it's just for illustrative, educational purposes here today, but in the real world, with our real photos, we want those targeted adjustments to be absolutely perfect. So let's take a look at some of the ways that we can evaluate our layer masks. First, I have a targeted adjustment, of course, here. I can apply an exaggerated adjustment to get a better sense of whether or not the effect is happening in the right place. So here, for example, well, let's take one little step back. Here, if you look at the thumbnail for my, in this case, hue saturation adjustment, you can see very clearly, just from the tiny little thumbnail, that my painting job was not very good if I'm trying to affect the water in the foreground and not the rest of the image. But under normal circumstances, it might not be that obvious, but I could apply an exaggerated adjustment. So you saw me a couple of times using a very strong curves adjustment, or in this case, hue saturation. Whatever the adjustment is that I'm applying, I can make it very exaggerated in order to get a sense of whether or not that layer mask is affecting the correct area of the image. I could also turn off the effect of the adjustment and bring it back. Now I can turn off the actual adjustment and bring it back, or I can turn off the mask. So let's go ahead and make my adjustment a little bit more exaggerated so that it's more obvious. If I hold the Shift key on the keyboard while clicking on the thumbnail for my layer mask, that layer mask will be temporarily disabled, meaning I'm temporarily making it as though the layer mask was filled with white, so that the adjustment affects the entire image. Then I hold the Shift key and click again, and the adjustment layer is now only being affected based on the layer mask. The layer mask is enabled again, and by toggling back and forth, if you pay attention to the area I'm trying to adjust, you get this kind of very obvious, almost blinking effect, where now all the water is pink and green, and then it's pink, green, and there's some blue areas as well. Another option that I find very, very helpful is to actually look directly at the layer mask itself in all its full resolution glory. Because remember, I've mentioned a couple times that a layer mask is really just an image being used in a fancy way. Well, if I hold the Alt key on Windows or the Option key on Macintosh and click on the thumbnail for the layer mask while holding that Alt or Option key, I can see the actual layer mask itself versus the rest of the image. Now, of course, for much of my image cleanup work, in this case cleaning up a layer mask, if I'm using the brush tool and I want to paint with white in order to make sure that the top of the water is being affected, I can paint using the image itself. But once I have the transition nice and tidy, so in this case the transition between the water that I want to adjust versus the rest of the image, then looking directly at the layer mask actually can be a lot easier. I can more clearly see where I maybe missed a little spot, and while I'm in this view, I can actually, for example, paint with white in the areas where I want to reveal the adjustment. If there were some patchy areas up in the upper portion, I could paint with black. So again, using the brush tool, the letter D on the keyboard for the default colors of white and black for a layer mask, that would be black and white for an image layer, and then the letter X on the keyboard to exchange the foreground and background colors, so I can switch easily between painting with black to block an adjustment and white to reveal an adjustment. So I find that those techniques can be incredibly helpful. Again, an exaggerated adjustment, taking a look at the adjustment on versus off, the layer mask on versus off, and then ultimately looking at the actual layer mask itself by holding the Alt or Option key and clicking on it. And then we can get an adjustment that is only affecting, in this case, the water in the foreground, for example. So great ways to evaluate the layer mask as you're working on cleaning things up. And speaking of cleaning things up, so I've not feathered most of my layer masks yet here today, and I've not really done much in the way of cleanup. Let's take a look at some of the issues related to cleanup. Your new best friend, select and mask mode. And so I'll just make a very quick selection here. So I'm going to use the magic wand with the contiguous option turned off so that I can somewhat quickly and easily create a selection of the sky here. And let's assume that that's pretty good. I think it looks to be nearly perfect, including getting these interior portions included as part of the selection. Little area that I needed to add to there. So using the magic wand with contiguous turned off, a relatively low setting for tolerance, and then clicking to start creating a selection and holding the Shift key to click in additional areas until we have a good selection. And then I'll add a curves adjustment and once again make an exaggerated adjustment. Now, the stronger the adjustment, the more careful you need to be with your layer mask. The more you need to kind of zoom in and carefully evaluate so that, for example, we see that we have too harsh a transition and it also is maybe not quite in the right position. Well, we already looked at the ability to apply feathering. So I could increase the value for feather, but there's actually more that I need to do to this area of the image, to the layer mask, in order to get things cleaned up perfectly. And so instead I want to use the select and mask mode. So I have the select and mask button here that I could click. You can also set an option in preferences so that you can simply double click on a layer mask and that will take you into select and mask mode. Again, you could also click the select and mask button that is available on that properties panel or on the options bar up at the top if you're working with one of the selection tools. So the first thing, generally speaking, is to adjust the feathering. And there are two key considerations here. Now, first off, feathering is probably almost always going to be applied, and the only question is how much. And the idea is, how big a transition do I need along that edge? In this case, not a tremendously large transition, so a couple pixels for that feathering works out pretty good. You can also adjust the contrast. Well, contrast is essentially the opposite of feathering. So if you had feathered a selection too much as the basis of your layer mask, you could actually increase contrast to tighten things up. But generally, if you need to tighten that up, you would just reduce the value for feathering. You can also smooth, so I'm going to unfeather here for just a moment. The smoothing option I don't generally use, and if I need it, I try to be really careful not to use too much. Think of smooth as taking what would be like a jagged selection edge, so you can see here it's sort of a stair-step pattern, and trying to smooth that out to get rid of those kind of jagged edges. If you go too far with it though, then you're going to find that the fine detail in the image is no longer being followed. And so if we go up to the beak area here, for example, the more we smooth this out, the more we're going to see that it probably is not following the edge very well. So notice I'm darkening the very tip of the beak because I've smoothed out that selection edge a bit too much and the rest of the selection is not following very well, etc. So if you feel that you need some smoothing, use a very low value, or at least be sure to very, very carefully check the overall image. So something like that looks to be a good edge. Except, as you can very easily see, we have a halo there, that bright edge around the bird. And so that is caused by the fact that my selection essentially, or my layer mask, isn't quite at the right position. I need to shift it inward. Well, there is a shift edge slider here so that I can push the essentially selection edge, if you will, or the layer mask edge inward in toward the bird, or pull it back outward toward the sky so that I can take that same edge that I've already feathered and adjust its position, hopefully getting everything lined up just right based on the adjustment that I've actually applied, etc. And then once you've dealt with that, then of course there's the issue of variation. So I have this fuzzy area, let's zoom out just a little bit here, this fuzzy area versus the rest of the image. And for that, I want to kind of do some blending work, essentially. And fortunately, select and mask mode gives me some options there. First off, I can increase the radius. This is essentially the area being evaluated to try and figure out where the edge is. So I could increase radius. I can also use smart radius so that areas that are crisp versus fuzzy will get a different value essentially associated with them. Let's go ahead and shift this edge inward just a little bit more. And so now overall, we're getting a better effect, but I do need to deal with the fuzzy little feathers down below. And that's where these adjustment options, these mask options come into play. The first is quick selection. So I can use quick selection to refine this area. I can also essentially think of this as intelligent painting versus, I don't want to call it dumb painting, but direct painting. So I can paint directly into the areas of the image that I want to add or subtract to or from the adjustment effect, that layer mask. And so usually I find that the quick selection option works best. So I could paint directly on this image with that second option in order to refine. and you'll see that I get this kind of bouncing around fuzzy effect. If I were to paint directly with my brush, I can paint black or white essentially. So I'm adding to the adjustment or subtracting from the adjustment. But I do find that that quick selection option, the first option there, usually provides the better approach. And so I could paint to subtract portions of the image from that adjustment effect or add to the adjustment effect. The key thing is to keep in mind that if we have an extremely strong adjustment, we're always going to have to fine-tune things, and probably we're going to have to use some more custom brushing later, which I think is easier done outside of the context of select and mask mode. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK to apply those changes. And then I'll grab my brush tool and I want to subtract, so I want to block the adjustment. So painting with black, for example, I can get out to the tip of the beak and paint away an area there. Painting with white if I need to add the adjustment in some areas, or black if I need to block the adjustment in areas. And for these feathers here, I'm going to paint with black using a relatively large brush, so you can adjust the brush size with the left and right square bracket keys, and the hardness, which is available on a pop-up here. I can set hardness to 0, or holding the shift key, left square bracket to reduce hardness, right square bracket key to increase hardness. And then using a relatively large brush, I could paint in order to kind of get that gradient type of blending effect. So painting the adjustment into the image versus away from the image. And then, of course, keeping in mind that if I use an adjustment that is not quite as strong, then the layer mask doesn't need to be quite as perfect. All right, so we essentially have run out of time, but I do want to add a couple bonus minutes here to address some questions from attendees here. So let's take a look at some of the questions. So Ron asks if Photoshop Elements offers the clipping group option. Yes, I would say the majority of what I've talked about here today does apply almost equally with Photoshop Elements. So a little bit of translation is involved, but you do have most of those same capabilities in terms of the layer masking. Oh, great question from David. Does the interface on Photoshop 2020, wow, it really is almost the year 2020, but is the interface pretty much the same as earlier versions? And yes, with, for example, 2019 version and a little before that, the select and mask mode changed a little bit. The implementation changed a little bit, but overall the interface is the same. So Adobe recently darkened up the interface, but more or less things are looking pretty similar to the way they always have. So if you're using an older version, even going back to Photoshop CS6, for those of you that aren't using the Creative Cloud version of Photoshop, most of these features will operate in the same way by and large. All right, let's see here. Import. So David's got a great question here. How to create accurate selections rather than the quick and dirty. Well, actually, what I would say is that I don't spend a whole lot of time creating accurate selections. I know it sounds a little bit silly, but I generally start with a rough selection because I find it so much easier to clean things up in the context of fine-tuning that targeted adjustment. So zooming in, so here's a great example of that. Instead of spending a bunch of time getting those marching ants to follow this line, and I don't even know for sure that it's going to be at exactly the right position, so I'd rather wait until I have an adjustment layer with a layer mask, for example, to create selections that are, rather than creating a selection that's perfect, I'd rather get a rough selection and clean it up after the fact because I find it's just more effective that way. And so here, for example, I need to reveal the adjustment in these additional areas. So I want to paint with white. So using a small brush, I can zoom in and get nice and close in on the image here and paint with white with a slightly softened brush edge and paint directly into the image and see the actual effect versus sort of trying to guess with that selection. And so, I know I joke about, please forgive me for not having a perfect selection. The reality is I almost never try to create a perfect selection in the first place because I'd rather work sort of more directly. Just, I guess the analogy would be in the same way that it is difficult to determine how much feathering you need to apply to a selection. It's a trial and error process, so I'd rather save the feathering for after I've created a layer mask. So too do I prefer to save the step of actually perfecting that selection for the layer mask phase, because the layer mask really is just a selection in a different form, but by working with that layer mask on an adjustment layer, I'm cleaning things up on the mask based on the actual effect on the image, rather than based on just that selection outline, which is not necessarily going to be particularly obvious, you might say. All right, so that is all the time that we have for today. We're a little over time, but I did want to address at least a few questions. If you have additional follow-up questions, feel free to submit those. We've got a contact form on the GreyLearning website, or you can send them to me via email, and I'll try to address as many of those as I possibly can in upcoming editions of the Ask Tim Grey email newsletter. And keep in mind also, if you want even more detail, I've got an entire course on creating accurate selections in Photoshop, courses on targeted adjustments in Photoshop, as well as creating composite images, applying adjustments, a wide variety of courses. All of those Photoshop-based courses are included in the Photoshop for Photographers bundle that you can get for 20% off using that information shown on the screen here. I know I mentioned at the last webinar presentation it might be the last one for this calendar year. This one really is our last webinar for 2019 as part of the GreyLearning webinar series. Thanks very much for joining me today. Happy holidays, happy new year, and we'll look forward to seeing you on a future presentation as part of the GreyLearning webinar series. Thanks very much.